Next question. What was the Hard Hat Riot? Well, that was in 1970, right? 1970, Richard Nixon was president. In the spring of 1970, Richard Nixon admitted that the war in Vietnam had expanded to Cambodia, right? The war in Vietnam was going on. It was very unpopular. And he got on TV and admitted that the war in Vietnam had expanded to Cambodia. And so because of that, the protests on college campuses erupted immediately afterwards because all these young people had been protesting. They wanted to end the war in Vietnam, and then it had expanded to a whole new country, Cambodia. So there was a wave of protests on college campuses around the country. Kent State University, May 4th of 1970, 4 students were shot down and killed by the National Guard. A couple weeks later, there was a massacre at Jackson State University in the South among college students who were protesting the Vietnam War. So, all over the country, there was a wave of sympathy for the anti-war movement. The fact that these students had been gunned down protesting the Vietnam War, and there was just a huge surge in protests. And, at Kent State University, a day or two before the students got shot down, the Army recruiting, the ROTC Army building at Kent State University had been lit on fire. And that was and after that, the governor of Ohio, Governor Rhodes, had gotten on television and said that the protesters were worse than the Nazis, worse than the Ku Klux Klan, worse than the communists. They were just the worst. He'd given this fired up speech against the students because they burned down the building. So then after that, all around the country, because these 4 students had been killed, all around the country, hundreds of Army ROTC buildings got lit on fire, hundreds of them. It's kind of like revenge for Kent State, right? And so hundreds of buildings were lit on fire, and Army buildings were lit on fire. And there were national protests in Washington, D.C. that were attended by hundreds of thousands of people every weekend. And it was just a huge upsurge in activism. All right. It was just a huge upsurge in activism. So, Richard Nixon was the president. And of course, the students all hated Nixon. They would it was really common. And it's funny because you can't do this now, but, things have changed, right, in terms of protest culture. But one of the very common things that students would do during those days is where they would say, Heil Nixon and Hitler salute. And the whole crowds of people would say Heil Nixon and Hitler salute. The message being that Nixon is a fascist. Nixon is like Hitler. And that was a really common thing that the anti-war protesters would do during those days, is they would, shout Heil Nixon, and they would all do the Hitler salute over and over and over again. These whole crowds of hippies would be shouting Heil Nixon and Hitler saluting. That was a really common thing. And there was a feeling that Nixon was this, he'd expanded the Vietnam War and he was supporting the FBI and cracking down on the Black liberation struggle. And that Nixon became a big target of the anti-war movement. The anti-war movement felt like Nixon, he'd gotten in there, he'd expanded the war in Vietnam. So he was their target. So Richard Nixon, sensed that he was under attack by this huge upsurge of activism that came in the spring of 1970. So he then called up his supporters. And in New York City, one of his biggest supporters was the Construction Workers Union. Bet you didn't know that. But construction workers unions in New York City at that point were whites only. Only white people could get in. I mean, it wasn't codified, but you had to be approved. You had to get an apprenticeship. Other members of the union had to invite you in. And so, so it was whites only. And they were a labor union, but they were making very high wages, the construction workers. I mean, hundreds of dollars an hour, right? I mean, it's if you were a New York City construction worker back in the 1970s, you were living pretty well, and they had a lot of money, and they were known to be, it's ironic because they were known to be militants, right? I mean, if in New York City, if you were building construction and you didn't hire union construction guys, they would show up with baseball bats and beat your face in. And the police wouldn't do anything about it because the police had a relationship with the construction workers union as well, right? And it was like they were a craft union, right? And not anyone could just join. You had to, and it was a very militant union, and that, if you were doing business in Manhattan and you were doing construction, you'd better hire union guys and you better make a contract with the union. And if you didn't, you were going to have problems real quick. And those construction unions, they didn't mess around. They were militant union guys, but they were right wing. They were Nixon supporters. They were supporters of Richard Nixon. They were hard hats. They called them the hard hats, and they wore hard hats. And there was like this pride, like, we're working men, we wear hard hats. And they hated hippies. The perception was hippies didn't work, right? Because there was a very strong economy in the United States back then, right? It was very easy to get a job in the 1960s, early 70s, right? And there was a perception of hippies. Hippies were these long-haired kids who didn't want to work, didn't want to get a job, just wanted to use drugs all day long, right? And New York City, Manhattan, was full of hippies in those days. And in fact, there was a building in Lower Manhattan that had LSD. It was in Greenwich Village. It was a building. It was like a whole building, and it said LSD on it, and it was for the League of Spiritual Discovery. It was run by Timothy Leary, and they just did nothing but give LSD out for free at that building all day long. So there were a whole lot of long-haired hippie people walking around New York City, stoned out of their minds all the time. Like Greenwich Village, there were a lot of hippies. And it was just young people walking around on drugs all the time, right? And there was a lot of Greenwich Village in particular. Chelsea, Greenwich Village was like, this was a section of Manhattan that was just inhabited by younger people that were on drugs all the time and weren't working. And, and that these hard hat guys hated hippies. So after the Kent State Massacre and after the huge upsurge of protests, Nixon, we don't know directly, there was a direct phone call or whatever, but Nixon supporters that were in the construction workers unions, they assembled with hammers and tools and other weapons, and they started attacking anti-war protests and beating people up with weapons. And it was called the Hard Hat Riots. And it was May of 1970. In the aftermath of the Kent Massacre, all of a sudden there was an explosion in all over New York City, mobs of guys in hard hats, construction hats, would roam the streets. It started out, they attacked a big anti-war protest that happened. And then after that, they started going up and down the streets of New York, beating up random hippies. They would see young people with long hair and wouldn't doing anything. They were just sitting there having long hair, and they'd say, "You faggot, you queer," and they would beat them up and beat them up pretty badly and injure them. And it was not good. It was a fascist kind of mobilization, right? It was their pushback against the anti-war movement. They supported the anti-war movement. And it was awful. It wasn't a good thing. It was a fascist mobilization. The anti-war movement was opposing the Vietnam War. They were supporting the war, and they were opposing the anti-war movement. And they saw the hippies as girly men or pacifists or gay people or something, and they called them anti-gay slurs, usually faggot, queer, whatever, and they would just violently beat up random young men for having long hair, and it was an awful moment. And it was, people talk about the aristocracy of labor. These were very well paid construction workers, and they were very pro-imperialist and right wing, and they were known for being violent, against the bosses. But this was a case of them being mobilized against hippies, and in support of the Vietnam War. At the time, Gus Hall, the leader of the Communist Party, he wrote a pamphlet about it. Actually, Gus Hall wrote a pamphlet. If I can reach up here, it's included in this book by Gus Hall, Working Class USA. Gus Hall wrote a short pamphlet directed to the construction workers called "Hard Hats and Hard Facts," and it was urging the construction workers to not attack the anti-Vietnam War protesters and making a class appeal to them. It was called "Hard Hats and Hard Facts," and it's in here somewhere. It's in this compilation of writings by Gus Hall called "Working Class USA: The Power and the Movement." And the Workers' World newspaper They showed and they took a picture of a crowd of these construction guys with their baseball bats and their American flags, and they had a sign that said like "America, love it or leave it" or something like that. But they photoshopped. Well, they didn't have Photoshop back then, but they pasted over their sign a sign that said "I love my boss." Right? Because they said basically what these construction workers were doing is they were going out to defend their bosses. And that's what they were doing, because it was the bosses of these multinational corporations headquartered in Manhattan that exploited, people all over the world. They were the ones that were benefiting from the Vietnam War, right? And so their bosses, who hired them to construct their buildings while they exploited people all over the world, they were the ones that were supporting the Vietnam War. So by going out and beating up anti-war protesters and beating up random hippies on the street, these hard hat riots, they were basically supporting their bosses. And so the workers' world, they had a picture of these guys in their hard hats that said, "I love my boss." And that was the correct assessment. Neat story about this, and then I will move on. I was born in 1987. This is all stuff that happened before I was born. You can read about it on Wikipedia, the hard hat riots, etc. But long story short, 2011, I was part of the Occupy Wall Street protests. And you'll remember that at one point during the Occupy Wall Street protests, Mayor Bloomberg announced they were going to send the police, they were going to clear the park. So that night, and it was a holiday. In New York City, you get Jewish holidays off, and it was Sukkot, which is the Sukkot or Sukkot, it's one of the Jewish holidays, the autumn festival. So I had the day off work. I worked at the insurance company. And so they announced they were going to clear the park. So starting at like midnight, and especially like around 6 a.m., people just started piling into the park to defend the park from the police, right? And they didn't end up raiding the park, but it was like they announced they were going to raid the park. So everyone started piling into Occupy Wall Street. So it was about midnight. I was heading down to Occupy Wall Street with a bunch of signs that I was carrying that said, like, socialism for the 99%, capitalism is the problem, something like that. So as I'm coming out of the subway with these signs, in a cab coming by, this Wall Street guy who'd been drinking, like, rolls down his window and shouts at me like, "Get a job, hippie." Shouts at me like, you socialist, get a job or something like that. So then I didn't see, but I'm coming out of the subway and there's a bunch of construction workers around the subway side. So I'm coming up with my signs and this guy in his cab shouts, "Get a job." But then immediately the three like construction worker guys who were working there, they shouted back at the Wall Street guy, like, "Shut up, you 1% motherfucker. I bet you haven't done a day's work in your life. These kids are standing up for the truth." And these construction worker guys were all supporting me. I thought that was pretty neat. So when I got to the park, I, carried my signs, and I'm giving my signs to the boomer communists that are there at the park. And I told them about what happened. I said, I just came out of the subway, and, this guy, this Wall Street guy and his, cab was shouting at me. And then all these construction worker guys in their hard hats who were working on the subway stop, they defended me. And they all started crying. They all started sobbing. Like it was the most beautiful thing they'd ever heard. The most beautiful thing they'd ever heard. Why? Because of the hard hat riots. Because they had lived through the hard hat riots. They remember when the hard hats were patrolling Lower Manhattan and beating the hell out of anyone who sounded like a leftist or a socialist. And so, it was kind of a moving moment for them. Wow, the construction worker guys are supporting the protesters. They're supporting the Occupy Wall Street protesters. And then later that day, in the park, as thousands of people were gathering to defend Occupy Wall Street, there were a lot of construction worker guys in their hard hats that were supporting Occupy Wall Street because they were seeing their union benefits being cut. They were seeing their union contracts under threat. And they had a populist 99% against 1% message, right? And so it shows that things have changed. And it was a beautiful moment, but you really need to take that to heart. We need to be populists now. It makes sense why people weren't populists in the boomer years, because populism back in those days meant the silent majority. It meant the hard hat riots. It meant Nixon, love it or leave it. But nowadays, we can, as communists and Marxists and anti-imperialists, speak for the 99%. So we shouldn't shy away from populism. That's the thing, is that the political landscape has changed. The fact that those construction worker guys were on my side against that Wall Street guy in the car. And that's the important thing, is that the hard hat riots happened when things were very different. There is no labor aristocracy anymore. The living conditions of the American working class have vastly decreased. Those construction worker guys in their hard hats are not making the huge salaries, the huge wages that they used to make. I mean, they're doing okay in Manhattan, but I mean, their union contracts are under attack. Non-union construction jobs happen all the time in Manhattan, and they can't do anything about it. Unions have nowhere near the power they used to have. And as a result, average working class people are much more class conscious, and they're much more anti-establishment. So the political landscape has changed. 1970, the hard hat riots, these like right-wing populist construction worker mobilizations against hippies and support of the Vietnam War, that's a long time ago. That's like ancient history, right? And that the political landscape has completely changed. And I mean, I witnessed that, and I learned about the hard hat riots from people who'd been there. And things have changed. Things are not like that anymore. So that's my response to the question about the hard hat riots. I hope that was helpful.